answer, and I think since you raised 235 I was planning to talk about it towards the end. So I think I want to respond to Neeraj as well since he raised the question. So let me begin with that and then go off the book. I think as Professor Pandey said, 235 is a very important right. As all of us know, it was not there in the 1898 CRPC. It was introduced in the 1973 CRPC. And I agree that in the Salman Khan case, the fact that I think just a few minutes were given before the next part of the process began indicates the importance or the lack of it that the court showed to the sentencing process and 235 as if it's just a procedure to be followed rather than the importance that it has in the entire criminal trial itself. And I think that reflects the manner in which sentencing has been treated both by courts as well as academia when you say that most textbooks don't have anything on 235. But one thing that normally comes up in the context of adjournments and 235 is the amendment made to 309 in 1978, if I'm not wrong, where a proviso has been put by Act 45 of 1978 that says provided also that no adjournment shall be granted for the purpose only of enabling the accused person to show cause against the sentence proposed to be imposed on him. And this comes in right after 1973, although the Supreme Court sort of has ignored the existence of that proviso to 309 and repeatedly in cases including Justice Emily and others have said that a pre-sentence hearing is a right and adjournment should be granted. So I think 309 itself, the amendment itself negatives what the Law Commission had said prior to the 1973 report that this is a stage of the process where, as the Supreme Court said in the case of Sarkar Singh, evidence can also be brought in by the parties in the question of sentence. Now, if you want evidence to be brought in on the question of sentence, which is hardly done, then you need time because you don't know coming into the court that day whether it's going to be a conviction or a acquittal. So if there's a conviction, then you get time to argue only on issues of sentence. And the problem that ends up happening is instead of arguing on issues of sentence, you argue again back on merit, saying circumstantial evidence, etc., etc. Or the other thing is for sympathy, where you try and sympathize with it. We try to get the judge to sympathize with the accused and say, oh, this person is so and so and so and so, which is why you should be giving a lesser sentence. So that's the framework which I want to keep in mind as I go ahead with my presentation on sentencing. Now, what I propose to do is to look at the manner in which courts have talked about how an appropriate sentence has to be decided, to look at the research that is existing on questions on disparity in sentencing and the solutions that various jurisdictions have taken in relation to that disparity, and also again to talk more about how we can contribute as academics to research and work on sentencing. I'll begin again with the Criminal Amendment Act of 2013 and the entire approach to sentencing that was taken there. I'll actually go one step back and go to the Criminal Amendment Act of 1983. We also made amendments to the rape laws, all the person. And if you look at writing during that time, the introduction of the minimum sentence and harsher sentences for rape was introduced with the objective of general deterrence. You could see the debates around that time, the literature around that time, indicating that that was the objective of the legislature in bringing general deterrence, which is why the minimum sentence was introduced. And of course, judicial discretion was retained with the discretion of the judge to reduce sentence by giving adequate special reasons. Studies thereafter clearly indicated that courts were not giving reasons which were neither adequate nor special to reduce sentences, although repeatedly the Supreme Court said that from cases like Gurmeet Singh to state of Karnataka versus Krishnappa and others, that you have to be very sensitive in sentencing, especially in cases of rape. And the term adequate and special is an important term, and you have to give valid reasons and justifications before reducing sentences. But the same Supreme Court at the same time, in multiple cases, said in the interest of justice or because of young age or bit of passion, etc., and reduced sentences. After December 16, 2012, again, as all of us know, there were calls for harsher punishment for rape. There was a belief that to increase sentences, for bringing the death sentence, lifelong sentences, that would deter people from committing rape, and accordingly, sentences were increased across the board from 354 up to various 376 offences. So the question is, was this the solution that was required at that time? Again, there are enough studies done on the question of adequate and special reasons. What was the problem with sentencing? So that then takes us back to, was there a problem? And to be able to understand whether there was a problem, we need to first define disparity in sentencing. Because without a definition of disparity, we cannot say that sentences are disparate. And you have Professor Andrew Ashworth, Julian Roberts, Andrew Von Hirsch, and many more of them who try to be explicitly on sentencing, beginning the entire work of saying that first define disparity. And they say, and justifiably so, that disparity in sentencing is good. You cannot have everybody getting the same sentence. If everybody gets the same sentence, that is as arbitrary as if everybody getting different sentences, because that means you're not taking factual situations into account. So what is the problem is not warranted disparity, which they say is these are answers, but unwarranted disparity. And unwarranted disparity they define as a circumstance where courts consider reasons which go beyond the stated theory of punishment followed by the statute, or which has come into guidance to courts, or use extra legal or extra constitutional reasons in their sentencing process. And so that is unwarranted disparity in sentencing. Now, was there unwarranted disparity in sentencing? In the death penalty context, we have a lot of studies. We have had the Supreme Court in Santosh Kumar Bariyar saying that yes, there is a disparity in sentencing. It does sentence, it's not principal sentence. Again, in a couple of other cases, the Supreme Court again articulated that view. I studied rape sentencing in detail. I looked at all judgments given by all high courts, Supreme Court, and reported in the Tribunal Journal between 1984 and 2009, in a 25-year period, to see whether there is disparity of sentencing. And I used regression analysis, statistical analysis, to analyze as to whether what were the factors that were impacting sentencing in rape. And I found, as people had said earlier, that there was a huge impact of rape myths and stereotypes on the sentencing process. So things like past sexual history, the marital status of the victim, the relationship between the accused and the victim definitely had an impact on sentencing. So did acquaintance rape. Injuries were considered a very important factor. So my theory was that because of the manner in which the discretion of courts had been taken away in the guilt adjudication phase of the trial, all the stereotypes that existed in that phase had neatly moved into the sentencing phase, and courts were now using sentencing as a place where they exercise the discretion, exercise the sympathy. When they had doubt, they didn't acquit, but they sort of brought it down in the sentencing process. Something I mentioned earlier when I spoke to you earlier, the second in statutory rape cases, as I said, they were giving period undergone because they felt that this was consensual cases, and that was not the sentence warranted. Similarly, I found that with Gurmeet Singh and Prakash Jain, the court saying court testimony should be taken. Any case where courts were convicting based on court testimony, sentence automatically came. So you had a situation where the court said, I believe you, but since you are the only witness, let me give a little bit of leeway to the sentence. So going back to those definitions of disparity, I concluded that yes, there was unwarranted disparity in sentencing, and we need to do something about it. But the major concern for me, reading all these around 1,000 cases was that there was hardly any reasoning. So most of the earlier conclusions that I was talking about are derived from statistical analysis of the asking questions of each judgments. But when even in that process, you have a 20-page judgment, maybe 100 paragraphs. The 100th paragraph is on sentencing. There's nothing else in the judgment that ever talks about anything to do with sentencing. Right? And that was, I think, a major factor which was of concern, that courts were not thinking that it was important for them to give reasons why they sentenced someone to 5 years, 7 years, 9 years. Right? Even the Salman Khan order, if you read the Salman Khan order, you don't see any reasoning about sentencing. He's gone about on Kargil homicide, etc. But in sentencing, it's just arguments placed by one counsel, arguments placed by other counsel, and on the facts and circumstances, this is sentence. Right? So if I were the accused, I don't know why I got what I got. Similarly, in taking celebrity cases, Sanjay Dutt, but why did he get the sentence that he got? It is a situation when people, both the accused might say, oh, I am suffering because I'm a celebrity. And the public, because they view no reasons, say, oh, because he's a celebrity, he got away. So the accountability that the judiciary has is something that they have not recognized when it comes to the sentencing process. So how should courts determine appropriate sentence? We had the Law Commission of India in its 47th report give us detailed instructions on how sentence should be given, and I just read from that. The Law Commission said, a proper sentence is a composite of many factors, including the nature of the offence, the circumstances extenuating or aggravating of the offence, the prior criminal record, if any, of the offender, the age of the offender, the professional and social record of the offender, the background of the offender with reference to education, home life, sobriety and social adjustment, the emotional and mental condition of the offender, the prospect for the rehabilitation of the offender, the possibility of a return of the offender to normal life in the community, the possibility of treatment or training of the offender, the possibility that the sentence may serve as a deterrent to crime by this offender or by others, and the present community need, if any, of such a deterrent in respect to a particular type of offence. Sort of saying both rehabilitation and deterrence. And this paragraph in the 47th report of the Law Commission gets, as you know, cited repeatedly by the Supreme Court, where it says this is what we need to keep in mind while giving sentence. So there you see that in the case of Modi Ram versus State of Madhya Pradesh in 1972, you see that in the entire death penalty jurisprudence starting from Jagmohan, and a lot of these principles then get ingrained in terms of how should you give sentence. And then I think when we look at the entire question of theories of punishment, I think we can neatly divide the Supreme Court's jurisprudence decade by decade as to what was the focus in terms of theory. In the 1970s, you had Justice Krishna Iyer, the entire focus was reformation. Cases like Radhendra Prasad, Sunil Batra, Ningala Vijay Kumar, Charles Sobraj, Ramashray Chakravarti, Ediga Annamma, multiple cases where the Supreme Court says that the purpose of punishment is reformation. And most of these cases you have Justice Krishna Iyer on the bench. You have one or two cases which disagree with it when you're not on the bench saying, no, we don't think that's the purpose, but in multiple cases saying reformation is the purpose. 80s is a mixed bag. We don't see that much clarity on whether they have moved away, but they still are on reformation. It's the 90s where there's a sudden change, going from reformation to retribution. And the articulation begins, in my assessment, with Dhananjay Chatterjee, 1994, where the Supreme Court brings in the theory of society's cry for justice and says that the society's cry for justice is an important factor that needs to be kept in mind in sentencing. And subsequently, 2 years later, in the case of Duvula Chinna Venkateshu, the Supreme Court said, and I quote, citing Sir James Stephen, that the criminal law proceeds upon the principle that it's morally right to hate criminals and it confirms and justifies that settlement by inflicting upon criminals punishment which expresses it. So you move, and this is AR 1996, Supreme Court page number 1926. AR 96, Supreme Court 1926. So you move from reformation to saying it's okay to hate the criminal, right? And you have to give punishments to express society's sort of hate towards the criminal. And you see both Tanzania actually and this case sort of laying down the foundation for what happens in the 2000s, where with society's cry for justice, you bring in what the Supreme Court believes is the theory of proportionality, where they say we need to keep proportionality in mind and society's cry for justice, and that leads to increase in punishment, especially in certain set of offences, be it sexual offences, death sentencing, and others. And as academics working in criminal law, we know that Supreme Court was not really using the theory of proportionality, because if you read Professor Andrew Waters and how he describes proportionality, it's not what the Supreme Court was doing. It was not doing looking at sets of cases to see whether one was more serious than the other. It was not looking at offences, whether the punishment it was offences were proportional or not. And then slowly, like I said, be it in Bariyar or in the state of Madhya Pradesh versus Bablu Nat, or state of Punjab versus Prem Sagar, most of Justice Sinha's term, he starts talking about reasoning in sentencing and it entire question of lack of reasoning in sentencing. And now in the last few years, there was a complete mixture going more again towards so-called proportionality versus with society's cry for justice. So the Supreme Court has thoroughly confused everyone as to what the theory of punishment should be, or how sentences should be given. What has happened at the policy level? You had the Maniman Committee report, which in the one chapter of sentencing said let's introduce sentencing guidelines. UK has sentencing guidelines, it would be introduced that in India. The Menon Committee subsequently also reiterated the Maniman Committee's recommendations and said that we should introduce sentencing guidelines. But both these committees did not base their conclusions on an evidence-based assessment of whether there is a need for sentencing guidelines. And even if there is a need for sentencing guidelines, is the UK model appropriate in the Indian context? What has UK done? UK has studied the entire sentencing processes. You had D.A. Thomas who wrote extensively from the 1970s, studying every sentencing decision, so that the entire body of his work to rely on before they came up with any sort of solution. We don't have that, and so would it be something that we can use at all? So what is the sentencing guideline? Two definitions which might be important in a discussion on sentencing guidelines. One is by Professor Duff, who says a sentencing guideline is a piece of authoritative advice issued to sentencers about how they should go about deciding the sentences they are to impose. And then Professor Vasik, who says guidelines are a flexible device to ensure that all sentencers take into account similar factors when determining punishment. And importantly, he says they are not meant to provide a right answer, but only to inform, advise, and guide decision making. So basically, we are talking about uniformity of approach, not uniformity of conclusions. And in a lot of discussion on sentencing guidelines, that is lost, and the process goes towards uniformity of conclusion rather than uniformity of approach. Again, if you look at Professor Ashworth and his work on sentencing, he talks about a theory of equality in sentencing and equal impact of sentences. I think two excellent books. One is his continuing sentencing and criminal justice. New edition comes out again on that, which really adds a lot of material to it. And there's a book called Aggravation and Mitigation in Sentencing by Julian Roberts, a set of essays on aggravating and mitigating scholars from various parts of the world except Asia, and discussing various theoretical dimensions with respect to activation and mitigation of sentencing. And here, the entire articulation of theories of equal impact and equality of sentencing, you can see there. So what are the various ways in which we can regulate the entire, what are the ways in which you can have sentencing guideline models? One is the legislative regulation model, where you provide a maximum punishment like you have in the IPC and then leave it to judges, that you have full discretion to sentence within the period of years that is provided by the statute. The second is mandatory sentences, where you absolutely have no discretion, and they slowly move in our rate law towards a system of partly of mandatory sentences. They rarely use in most parts of the world. And then there are mandatory minimums, again, because of the 13 amendments. Now, Professor Ashworth, after having studied mandatory minimums, says that when you have mandatory minimums, courts have a tendency to impose that mandatory minimum. They will not go above it. Prosecutors in jurisdictions where prosecutors have the possibility, complete freedom to do charging, will ensure that they charge for offences which are mandatory, because that makes the job easier as well. He says tendency to acquit also increases, because when you have a mandatory minimum, when the judge feels that his or her right to sentence has been taken away, even an iota of doubt will lead to acquittals. Right? And this was the experience studied in South Africa, where there were mandatory life sentences for certain types of rape. And there again, they had the similar adequate and special reasons rationale. And so studies in South Africa show that multiple cases, the most gruesome of rapes, courts were finding some reason or the other, which then sort of created furor because they were commenting on the character of the victim or doing something bad to reduce sentence, because they were not finding anything else to reduce sentences. The second model is the judicial model of guidelines. One is appellate review, which again we have where you rely on appellate courts to correct errors by the lower courts, and in their judgments, while correcting that, provide sort of guidance to subordinate courts on the sentence. And also UK followed and Australia followed a system of guideline judgments, similar sort of sentencing type judgment, where you lay down, take a particular crime and say these are the factors that should be kept in mind and these are the factors that should not be kept in mind. And then there is the predominantly US model, which then started moving to other jurisdictions, of having sentencing commissions. You set up a sentencing commission researches into questions of sentencing, and then come up with numerical guidelines. We had the beginning while Professor Andrew Von Bush in Minnesota, when we had considered sentencing guidelines, we used the theory of proportionality. The federal crimes in the US had the federal sentencing guidelines, which came in 1984, and still continue, except that they're not mandatory as they used to be earlier. So those are the various ways that jurisdictions have looked at how to reduce unwarranted disparity in sentencing. So what then are the methods of dealing with discretionary powers? One way is to eliminate discretion, which is what we have done in 2020. But discretion definitely has its advantages. It requires situations where the judge has to look at the offender's characteristics and the reason why the crime was committed, etc. So that is important. Another very interesting theory is in the context of discretion theory itself, where Peter Ozanne talks about what is called the hydraulic theory of discretion. The hydraulic theory of discretion is a very interesting and simple concept which says that discretion is like water in a pipe or any fluid in a pipe. If you press the pipe at one point, the fluid will just move to somewhere else in the file. So Ozan says that discretion is something like that. You cut it somewhere, it will just move somewhere else. You cannot really control where in the system discretion will move. This was the experience in the US when they took away judicial discretion in sentencing process. The most powerful person in the system became the prosecutor. The prosecutor ended up determining sentence. The judge ultimately was only doing the gatekeeping role in terms of evidence in the trial. Sentencing, the judge had no role because either it was pre-bargained or the prosecutor decided which ingredient of the offence would it be under and predicted the sentence to a few months, right? And so this is a major criticism of removing the sentencing process. What might happen in India? Do our prosecutors have that much discretion? No. The people who exercise that discretion in India are the police. So you cut away discretion in one part of the system. You are giving more power to the police because then they decide while filing the FIR which limb of the section should you go under and then end up determining the sentence. Right? So if in the context of 376 you decide whether it should be 376 1, 2 and the moment you put it into one of the, if you put it in 376 2 minimum sentence is 10 years. You put it within 354 or 354 B or C like, 354 B like we decided the other day. You can determine whether the maximum sentence should be 5 years or maximum sentence should be 3 years. So that is the problem that Ozan says happens when you actually eliminate sentencing or any sort of discretion in the system. So what could the solution possibly have been? One thing that the UK sentencing guidelines have started doing and very usefully is to identify a primary justification, offence to offence, the primary justification of sentencing. So you say for theft, we believe that say rehabilitation is the theory that we use. Then you construct your sentencing factors accordingly. You designate what they call the starting point, typical sentence. You say that this, if there are no aggravating or mitigating circumstances, the general sentence for an offence like this would be say 5 years. So that's the starting point. The judge has the discretion of going upwards or downwards depending on aggravating or mitigating circumstances or other factors that are available. However, UK guidelines say that the judge has to give reasons why he or she is using X factor or the Y factor in departing from the typical sentence and also has to give reasons why he or she is giving the typical sentence. Because one thing in terms of decision making that all of us know in our daily lives as well, if someone gives us a peg, right, says what is the marks that you can give in a paper, the minimum is 50. You will start from 50, right? Or safer still, you will give 50 because there is something someone is telling you. If you say 0 to 100, then you have to put in a little more effort. If someone says the average is 50, you will be happy to give the average. You just put 50 to everyone, right? And that's decision making across the world. Psychologists study that and they say it is called this sort of when movement in decision making. Someone gives you a peg, you will just latch onto it, and then you'll be safe because then nobody can tell you your decision is bad because you were too liberal or too strict. Similarly, in sentencing, the moment you give a typical sentence, you probably latch on to it. Why the UK Sentencing Commission says that even if you give the typical sentence, you have to say why, which then brings you an accountability to say you have not just been safe and given that. I found in my study that 80% of cases of rape in trial courts gave 7 years, 376. No reason. I asked judges, they said it's a safe thing to do. Right? In program of the program, when I asked judges, they said, you know what happens? I give 7 years. Honorable High Court will not reverse me. Right? There's nothing there if I give lesser sentence, then they might past pictures might say things about me which will affect my promotion. Similarly with the High Court. Although the High Court was the place where sentences actually really got reduced or increased, so my conclusion was that the problem is not with the trial courts, the problem is the High Courts. Because it is the High Court judges who are sort of tampering with the entire sentencing process.
The High Court judges who are exercising more discretion in their profession and everything.
Third,
They are reducing it.
so like I said, 80% in trial courts, High Courts come down to 55%. Right? Because, and then no reasons. So that's what's happening. So reasoning is still very important because that gets you away from this being safe. Then there was that interesting approach followed by Justice Muralidhar in the case of State versus Bharat Singh. It was a case of death, it was a death sentence, and he, using Bachchan Singh and all other cases, said all these cases are talking about, is this person capable of being reformed? How does a judge sitting in the High Court figure out whether the person is capable of being reformed or not? So let us send a probation officer to look at the circumstances and figure out whether the person is reformed or not. When if you read the judgment after that, what did she do? Yeah. So after that is very interesting. Right? So what the probation officer did, with Justice Muralidhar records in the judgment that he gives life, he doesn't give the death sentence. He gives life on the basis of one psychiatrist saying he can't be on reform. But what the probation officer did, went to the jail, sat and observed this man for a day. Right? Said this is what he's doing, he's not worked recently, done this and done that. I went to his village, I spoke to the victims and gives a report. Is the probation officer trained to do this? Pandey was speaking about Section 360 and Probation of Offenders Act. How are probation officers appointed? What is the statute under which they are appointed? It's the Probation of Offenders Act, if I am not wrong. It's very difficult to find material on this because hardly, like I was saying, hardly anything. Nobody has written about probation and probation officer. So, this probation officer is someone appointed in the probation and of offenders act to look at young people, to see whether in those situations you can give probation or not and monitor it. 360 read with probation of offenders act. So, a probation officer, when suddenly the High Court says go ahead prepare a report on the basis of previous judgment of the Supreme Court, has no idea. Right? And you can't blame the probation officer for having no guidelines to actually do what she ends up doing. And so he doesn't say it as much in his final judgment, but he sort of says it's a useless report that he gets back from the probation officer. Although in this April 17th judgment 2014, he had said the man should be also examined by a board of psychiatrists. The board of psychiatrists examines and says we cannot say it's beyond reform, and on that basis he gives him the life sentence. But the probation officer in other parts of the world is a very important tool that a sentencing judge has when he or she is actually sentencing the accused. Because in most cases, because the manner in which we have looked at 235(2) as just a procedural requirement to meet, what are defense counsels doing? They are using exactly the same reasons across all their cases. Young man, if the person is below 35 or 40, after 40 old. Then family to, either if you're older, he has a family, it's mostly he, in a lot of these cases, has a family to take care of. If it's younger, sole breeder. And then basically socio-economic factors, poor, or if the person is rich, like Salman Khan or Sanjay Dutt, you say everybody else will suffer if you put this person into prison. So there's no thought going into what aggravating and mitigating circumstances, especially in non-death cases. In death penalty cases, at least some courts have to mention that in cases where there is no death penalty, hardly any sort of factors being cited. And what is relevant, what is irrelevant, we don't. UK guidelines, on the other hand, provide a list of irrelevant guidelines. It's not possible to give a list of relevant guidelines. So they say from experience, and any sort of sentencing related work cannot be static. It has to be dynamic. You have to be studying it year after year. So they say, based on experience this year, some courts have used these reasons. We don't think they're justified, so don't use these reasons any further. So therefore, you're laying down a standard. I'll conclude by talking about the Israeli sentencing guidelines system. It's very interesting. What Israel did, they used a mixture of all these guidelines systems, but they also said, on whom does the burden lie when arguing aggravating or mitigating factors? A question that the Supreme Court and the Law Commission had sort of touched upon in 1973 when they spoke about 235. So if I, as a prosecutor, am going up in the sentencing phase of the trial and saying the aggravating circumstances present that might lead to a death sentence or a maximum sentence, should I not prove it beyond reasonable doubt? One. Second, as the defense, if I am arguing mitigating factors, should I not show that this mitigating factor actually exists? Should I not need evidence to show that this person is actually the sole bread earner of the family? What are courts doing now? Courts are relying on good faith, on lawyers to argue before them, saying this lawyer will not misguide me. So it is, I know the lawyer, so he or she will not misguide me. So what Israel suggests is having a system where if you cite an aggravating factor, burden lies on the prosecution, and you have to prove that beyond reasonable doubt, because it's actually increasing your sentence. So it is, in terms of liberty, it's further curtailment of liberty. If it's a mitigating circumstance, then the defense has to need evidence to show that the mitigating circumstance exists, and that's on preponderance, not beyond reasonable doubt. So that system is just come in 2 years back. We don't know, we don't have many studies yet on how it's actually worked, but that's interesting because here someone's really gotten into looking at evidence during the sentencing process and in India, when we talk about 235(2), people still insist that 235(2) you cannot take evidence because 235(2) is just something to be done in the afternoon after the conviction is given, and let both parties argue and give the sentence immediately that very evening. So I think that more discussion and work on sentencing is essential to ensure, like Professor Nigel Walker said, that if criminal law, I used this quote by doing presentation of sentencing, he said if criminal law is the Cinderella of jurisprudence, then sentencing is Cinderella's illegitimate baby. Right? So that is the amount of importance that everyone gives to research or writing or judgment, something. That's not that.